Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we are marking a very important anniversary. In September 1939, Germany invades Poland and the Second World War begins. The 6-week campaign would change the course of world history and even help set the stage for some of Europe's most difficult political problems today. Hi, Jesse. Another week, another podcast. Here we are again. So this time we're taking it all the way back to 1939 to the outbreak of the war. As I said in the intro sentence, there's a reason for that. The anniversary is coming up. So it's the perfect time, you might say, to look at this particular campaign, which probably it's, I would say, fair to argue, is quite often overlooked by most people because it's a relatively swift campaign. Apparently, it's German blitzkrieg at its best. We'll take this apart and see if that really is the case or not. And people basically just forget about this particular campaign. But I think that's wrong, as I said in the intro sentence, but also because we and as the armies did, can learn a lot from this particular episode of World War II. So again, as always, the usual question, where do we start? Where do we take it back to? I think, dear listeners, what's well established now is that we start by providing some context, which of course leads to some rabbit holes and tangents, as always. So this is inevitable. But as we know, it is important to set the scene, to provide the stage and set the stage for this particular campaign. And Poland, particularly German-Polish relations in the 19th century and before, are difficult. It's a very difficult topic. It takes some time to analyze, to unpack. So, dear listeners, please bear with us. Don't worry, we're not going to give you the next 5 episodes on 18th, 19th century German-Polish relations, but it is important to talk about this so we understand what actually happens in 1939 and why Germany decides to invade Poland. So, Jesse, where do we start? Where shall we take it back to? What do you think?
Well, I'm going to start, I think, with a couple of reminders that when I read about the campaign or when we do some work on, a YouTube video about the campaign in Poland that I find helpful to keep in mind. One of them is that I think you're right that the Polish campaign sort of everybody knows that it happened. Everybody knows it kicked off the Second World War, although there's a little bit of a debate about maybe Japan and China, 1937, whatever. But usually we're then it was over, and then other stuff happened. So it's got that relevance to the wider global war that grows out of it, but it also has a regional component. And you mentioned already the idea of German-Polish relations. We'll get into that. So I feel like these two poles, no pun intended for all the dad joke lovers out there.
That was a bad one, by the way, but there we go.
So you have these kind of two elements to the origins of this war. You have the regional one that's about border provinces, and you have the global consequence. And there's one other, actually, I'm going to add one in, which is the ideological long-term ideas that the German authorities have about what should happen with this territory to the east of Germany. If I want to try to narrow things down in terms of what's relevant for us moving up to 1939, when the action starts, let's say, I think I'd probably start in the late 1700s, when there was a different Polish state, a Polish Commonwealth, which was quite substantial for a couple of centuries, one of the biggest and most influential states in Europe. But by the end of the 1700s, its neighbors get the upper hand and divide it up, called the Partition of Poland, right? So you don't have a country of Poland. You don't have a Polish state from the 1790s. Russia takes part of it. Germany takes part of it. And, Prussia at the time takes part of it, which then gets into Germany in 1871. And Austria takes part of it. So The next phase, I think, and I'm skipping over a lot, Matthias, you can add in a few, but just to bring us up to something that puts us directly on the path, the next phase I think that's relevant for us, so Polish state doesn't exist for 123 years. In 1918, all of those three powers that divided it, that I just mentioned, Russia, Germany, and Austria, they've all temporarily collapsed. Well, except for Austria, permanently collapsed. But yeah, in 1918. So Poland is recreated, or a new Polish state is created, depending on how you want to slice it, the Second Republic. And it gets territory. And that territory is going to be part of the recipe of troubles because its neighbors don't agree. The Germans are not very happy that they have to give up some regions. And quite a lot of people in Moscow, once Russia gets over the revolution, are also not happy that Second Republic Poland includes territories that were a part of the Russian Empire before. Some people not happy about that. There was even a war between the two sides, right? Bolshevik Russia fights the new Polish Republic for a couple of years after World War I and gives up some territory to Poland that the Poles, of course, think was theirs from this earlier period. Now, that is a very drastic summary of a lot of stuff. But Matthias, where do you want to add in a bit of spice to my very general summary there?
There is a lot going on, isn't it? It's an interesting part of the world. It's a confusing part of the world, you might say, in many aspects. So where do we go with this? Maybe if we go back to the Polish Commonwealth that you mentioned. So you've got the Polish Commonwealth, which for a time was also the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Again, dear listeners, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. Suffices to say that in the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, that was actually the largest state in Europe. People forget about this, so most people don't know this. And then you fast forward to the 17th century. Well, Jesse, you know Vienna extremely well. When you look at the siege of Vienna in the 17th century by the Ottomans, that was the Ottomans were defeated mainly by the Polish king who gets there. Other contingents as well. But again, you can see how important the state of Poland was in that early modern period. And then perhaps where it gets really interesting is when we get to the early 18th century. We already talked about the 18th century and the partitions. If you go a bit further back, perhaps to 1701, there's an interesting little episode, particularly when you look at German/Prussian and Polish relations. Because in 1701, the ruler of Prussia wants to make himself king. He thinks, well, just being an elector isn't good enough. I want to be a king. And so he needs to go to Poland and the Polish king because the territory of Prussia, which is modern day East Prussia, to keep it relatively simple, that was still controlled by Poland. Which also means when in 1701 we have the first Prussian king, he's actually called king in Prussia, not king of Prussia. So you can see there are all sorts of interesting little tangents and tensions that you can see here. And then, of course, you move forward to the partitions. You already mentioned them, the three major powers. And yes, and Poland disappears. Warsaw, for a short period, was actually under Prussian rule. Not very long until Napoleon gets in, but for a few years, it was ruled by Prussia. So, dear listeners, if you like the Nutcracker, here's the first tangent of the day. If you like the Nutcracker and you've seen the opera, that, of course, was, the book was written by a chap called E.T.A. Hoffmann, who lived in Berlin. Had a very interesting life because he was a lawyer during the day, and in the evenings he basically spent the evenings drinking wine in a wine bar in Berlin. That's where he wrote most of his stories and not poems, but basically it's stories, including the Nutcracker. But he also, as a lawyer, gets sent to Warsaw. So as a Prussian civil servant for a couple of years, he serves in Warsaw. Then, of course, Napoleon comes along and he has to leave again. But you can see all of that is going on. So it's really quite complex. The borders are constantly shifting at the time in the 18th century, early 19th century. One of the main reasons for that, and we will return to this, is that you don't really have a lot of natural borders and boundaries. You don't have a lot of mountains. You've got a number of rivers running mainly north to south. But for example, you've got the Vistula that sits right bang in Poland. So it's not really a border. You have minorities. One of the big problems you find, you've got all sorts of different nationalities. You look at the Polish themselves, you look at the German minorities in what's basically West Prussia, you look at Ukrainians and Russians in the eastern part. You just need to look at some of the names of towns and cities that you get. So, for example, when you go to Lviv, which of course is modern-day Ukraine, which was Polish in the old days. Well, first of all, it's Austro-Hungarian, so it's called Lemberg. Then it's Lvov, then it's Lviv. You can see it's very, very complex, and it makes it very difficult to establish a set state along proper boundaries and borders as defined in the 19th century when you've got the rise of nationalism. Say, are you Polish? Are you German? Are you Russian? Are you Austro-Hungarian? What are you? That makes it really, really quite complex. Then you have the First World War. Again, when you look at the guys, and we'll get to them at a later stage, who then become the ruling class, for example, of Poland, these are fighting in different armies. Some are fighting with the Germans, some are fighting with the Austro-Hungarians, some are fighting with the Russians. Again, makes it very, very complex. And then actually in 1916, that's also interesting. That is when for the first time you actually have a newly established Poland. And it is interesting that it is the central power, so it's Germany and Austria-Hungary, that create a new Poland. So why do they do that? Not because they like Poland or the Polish. They use it as a propaganda tool. So basically this new Polish territory, the new Polish state, which is a puppet state, is established on former Russian territory that they have seized. So they don't give away West Prussia or Galicia or something like this, but it's there in the territories that they've conquered from the Russians. They say, here's your own state. They hope that they will give them support from the Polish, and they will fight with them against the Russian. Doesn't really work. It kind of backfires. But this is, at least on paper, technically, it's the first time you have a Polish state since these partitions of the 18th century, with all the caveats that I just mentioned. Then you've got the end of the First World War. We probably need to go perhaps in a bit more detail there, but I realize, again, I've been rambling for quite some time. And I've only got to 1916 here. So, Jesse, back over to you. Do you want to fill in some of the gaps that you created in your first very broad comment?
I want to, as they say in French, bring in a précision, so clarify something. I mentioned there was no Polish state for 123 years till 1918. I meant no Polish independent state because, of course, as you mentioned in 1916, there's a kind of central powers puppet semi-state that's created. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians are arguing about who should have kind of control over the puppet. I've seen some very interesting political cartoons about that. Napoleon also created a puppet Polish state for a little while. They provided lots of troops for his invasion of Russia. So, where I think we want to bring it to a head, so to speak, is the end of the First World War. I think that's where we really get the immediate in the historical term, 20 years, right? The immediate situation that we're dealing with then at the outbreak of war in 1939 as well. So, these three empires that have divided Poland in the past, they are all in a state of helplessness and collapse. Some temporary, some permanent. What happens then is the peace settlement, the very controversial Peace of Versailles, wants to recreate a Polish state, and so do many Poles, especially, as you mentioned, these kind of elites, military leaders who were officers in the Polish Legion on the Central Powers side, or other qualified high-ranking officers on the Russian side. Of course, the Poles were not fully equal politically when they were divided and occupied by these three different empires. They probably had the best standing in Austria-Hungary. They provided quite a few, elite politicians and all this kind of thing. They were landowners in much of the Austro-Hungarian part. So you have this new Polish state that needs to gel after 1918. And that's very difficult to do. And one of the reasons it's difficult to do is because the peace settlement creates a lot of resentment in the part of the countries that think it's not fair. Basically, Germany and what will eventually become Soviet Russia, right? So there are these two regions that Germany has to give up, or two major regions, three actually, if I'm being more accurate. You have West Prussia. So everybody's heard probably of East Prussia, which in between the two world wars is like an exclave, so it's not connected to the rest of Germany. It's divided by a region, West Prussia, which is assigned to Poland. Within West Prussia on the coast is a famous city. Today it's Gdańsk in Poland. Before 1918, it was known as Danzig. It doesn't belong to Poland. It's administered by the League of Nations. It's considered a free city, but Poland gets to kind of administer it because it's a port. They need that port to have a viable economy, right? You can't just create a country that's landlocked and say, well, good luck to you. It's probably not going to survive. And the French and British want Poland to exist and survive because, especially for France, it's their ally now. Now that there's no Russia to help France, if ever Germany rises again, they're going to rely on what they have in Eastern Europe, which is Poland and some other smaller allies that they have. So they give West Prussia to Poland. They give another province in, well, what was Eastern Germany, what becomes Western Poland, called Posen in German, Poznan in Polish. And then there's also another region called Silesia in English, where today, for example, the Polish city of Wrocław is located more or less around there. So the Germans are not happy about this. And especially in Silesia, actually also in Posen, there's violence, there's fighting between German like Freikorps militias and even some German army troops before the army is fully disbanded, and new Polish militias, paramilitary groups, and then eventually there's a Polish army that's in the process of forming. The most bitter fighting is probably in Silesia, I would say. It lasts on and off for a couple of years. There's a very controversial vote. This region, as you mentioned, there's a lot of mixed populations in Central and Central Eastern Europe. So there are Polish-speaking people there. There are German-speaking people there. There are people whose identity is mostly local, where they speak the local Silesian dialect, which mixes Polish and German together. And there's a big fight and guerrilla warfare and a couple of pitched small battles. Annaberg, if anybody wants to Google the Battle of Annaberg, for example. So you have a controversial vote. Both sides say that the other side's cheating. It gives the most economically valuable parts of Silesia, which has a lot of mines and things like that, to Poland in order to help Poland become a viable state. So, even though, if you take all those areas together, I think from what I've read, it's safe to say the majority of people in those areas spoke Polish. But they were also filled with a heck of a lot of Germans who saw it all as unfair. So you have this kind of baked in problem in German-Polish relations that they're unhappy, the Germans essentially, with the creation of this new Polish state. The Soviets are also pretty unhappy about it, and I'll be quick here so I can stop my rant and turn it back over to you, Matthias, to fill in the gaps. But the Soviets are also unhappy because they get the worst of the peace settlement after their war with Poland. So they have a war over where the border should be in the eastern part of Poland. And it's it goes back and forth. There's some very dramatic campaigns in either direction. But in the end, Poland acquires some territory, because the Russians are worried about their own civil war that they're having between the Reds and the Whites. So Poland then acquires some territory that is today Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, and also part of Lithuania, today's Lithuania. The Poles generally feel, hey, this was our historic territory anyway, so no one should complain about this. The Russians feel the opposite, right? So this isn't right. And eventually, we're going to rectify this problem. So you have these two unresolved issues on either side that are local, that are border problems, but that are related to ideological problems. Because when the Nazis come along, they see the Polish state as completely illegitimate, the people are subhuman. When the Soviet Union gets on its feet, well, they want to spread the revolution. They see the Polish state as a creation of, the capitalist bourgeoisie powers of Britain and France. That's not an easy situation to live with if you're the smaller power in the middle, which is Poland.
Absolutely. They've got a bit of a problem, haven't they? They look quite strong in the, you might say, the early 1920s, perhaps to the mid 1920s. But then, as you already hinted at, the situation then, of course, changes again. And when you look at the Soviets, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, they lose quite a bit of territory. And that, of course, happens in a war. So they don't accept this and say, well, we want this back. It comes back to the famous battle around Warsaw, 1920, the Wonder on the Vistula, where the Soviets' advance was stopped. So if the Poles hadn't stopped the Soviets there, it's not inconceivable that basically most of Central Europe would have fallen under communist rule in 1920 because the Germans had lost the war. There is no army anymore. So that's another interesting aspect that I think is probably forgotten is too strong a word, but not much talked about, particularly outside of Poland. When you go to Poland, it's a very different story. I was in Poland not long ago looking at that particular battle, standing on these battlefields of the Wonder of the Vistula. In the Polish mind, it's still very much there. Does not apply to any other nation, I think. So that's, as you said, the Soviet side. You already talked about the Germans, and yes, it is. It's a problem. When you look at the people and the population, how they identify, it is probably fair to say that Poznan is more Polish than German. There is no question about this. West Prussia, again, there are certain pockets we might say are more German, some are more Polish, but the decision is taken that, well, they need access to the sea, as you already said, cutting off East Prussia, which East Prussia is also very, very important to the German mind at that stage, because that's the cradle of Prussia. This is where Prussia comes from. It's not Berlin. It is Königsberg in East Prussia. That embodies everything Prussia stands for these people. And you cut this off, that has quite a big meaning to Germans at that stage. And then, of course, you already talked about Upper Silesia. So that's the part where you have these plebiscites. Really difficult when you start zooming in. As you already mentioned, sometimes you have from village to village and town to town, you have shifting majorities. We want to be Polish, we want to be German. When you look at the results overall for Upper Silesia, they're about 60-65% for Germany and the rest for Poland. But that's too easy to say it that way because you have all these different pockets everywhere, and that makes it really difficult. And what really cheesed off the Germans then, come back to your point, is that the industrial area of Upper Silesia around Katowice is given to Poland, which had predominantly, again, it's difficult, you need to look at the different areas exactly, but also predominantly voted to remain German. And that really cheesed off the Germans because they thought they'd entered peace negotiations in 1918 on the famous 14 points by Wilson, one of which is self-determination of the people. And I said, so we go to this plebiscite and suddenly, well, that's not what you do here because we vote to remain with Germany and you're still giving these areas to Poland, which then brings in the Freikorps because the Germans don't have officially a proper army anymore, which then leads to, as you already mentioned, the very famous battle at the Annaberg, which again in 1920 and 1930 Germany is a big thing. Everybody knows about this. People who'd fought there as volunteers in the Freikorps, they were big heroes. You also have a number of senior later Nazi leaders who fought there. So it's really interesting. You can already begin to make the jump to the 1930s. So that's difficult. Why it's also very difficult for the Germans is it's not only the territory, but it's also the people who come from these territories. And by this I now mean, let's call them the leading class, the elite. Because in the German system, particularly the Prussian system, you had what's called the Junker class. So these are it's the land-owning class, the East Albion Junkers, as they're called, in the east of Germany, east of Prussia. And quite a few of these came from territories that are now given to Poland. Give one example, Ludendorff, the famous hero of the First World War. He was born in West Prussia. By the way, about 20 kilometers or so, I would have to check exactly, away from the place where Monash was born, who then becomes the great Australian general in the First World War. Different podcast. If you're interested in the First World War, dear listeners, listen to our sister podcast on the First World War. But it's interesting. You can see again how all this is coming together in a very small place. And that, of course, means that a disproportionate amount of people who came from these areas are quite influential in politics in Germany in the 20s, also still in the 1930s. And that perhaps makes it even more of a burning issue. You go to the West, if you compare this, you look, for example, to Alsace-Lorraine. That's different. Even though there had been these ongoing disputes between Germany and France from the 17th century onwards, is it German, is it French? In the 1920s, the Germans actually sign a treaty and say, you know what, okay, we realize this is no longer German and the French can have it, to cut a very long story short. The German foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann at the time, together with Aristide Briand, his French counterpart, he's given the Nobel Peace Prize. But Stresemann makes very, very, very clear, not publicly, but behind closed doors, that this is only a treaty about the western border. No one's talking about the east. Everybody in Germany was convinced that the moment Germany is strong again, Germany would get the lost territories in the east back. That was just that went without saying through, you might say, nearly all of the political classes in Germany at that particular time, because that was really seen as one of the major embodiment of the unlawfulness, the unfairness of the Versailles Treaty. So that's the thought in the national German side that you have at that time, and this is why this is such an important issue. And everybody, as I said, agreed. The moment Germany is strong again, they're going to get these territories back. How? There are different ideas. This is also why in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, Poland was called the season state. So basically, once Poland's season is over and Germany is strong again, Poland will disappear. And everybody was pretty much clear about this. So very, very difficult for the Poles. On top of this, you then have this, as you already mentioned and explained, these different factions, these different groups. Right? It sounds relatively easy. While bringing this country together, just think about very simple things like, I don't know, schooling. So when you went to a school in the German-occupied territories, it was very different from what you had in the Russian territories. You would speak German. Of course, you also speak Polish, but you also speak German because there was a phase of Germanization. The Russians did the same thing. So you can see it makes it really, really complex and really, really difficult. So you can only really hope that you're going to survive as a state in a geostrategic situation like this, where you're surrounded by, or flanked, you might say, by two nations that are weak at the moment, but will probably get stronger again, the Soviet Union and Germany, and then you have a problem. So what is it that you need to do? You need to find alliances. That's the important thing. And of course, this is what they do. And you already talked about the French coming in here. So as our in-house Frenchman, Jesse, enlighten us perhaps on the French-Polish dimension of all this, or further international relations as well.
Sure. I mean, like you say, you're Poland, you know you're going to need allies, right? And the French are essentially Poland's main ally. They signed an alliance already, I think in 1921, if memory serves. And that alliance is going to loom large in 1939 when World War II breaks out, the Germans invade, because within that alliance framework, the French agree if Germany attacks Poland, France will launch an offensive to help Poland. And this is kind of Poland's great strategic hope, that they'll be able to rely on France in case it ever comes to a conflict with Germany in particular. With the Soviets, it's a little more complicated because the French were not so keen on committing to war with the Soviet Union over Poland. But with the Germans, at least, that was the hope. The Poles do also try to negotiate a few other diplomatic solutions to their difficult situation. They signed non-aggression pacts with both Germany and the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. But as you can imagine, dear listeners out there, given all this background that we've been talking about, historical, but also ideological, that neither the Soviet Union nor eventually Nazi Germany really see Poland as a legitimate country that should be part of the international system, that you can have agreements with. They don't really see it that way. So those non-aggression pacts end up kind of being scraps of paper. They're convenient for everybody when they're signed in the early 1930s because Germany's concentrating on remilitarizing the Rhineland in the West, for example. So they'll calm down the East while they're doing that. That kind of thing. The Soviets are worried about forced collectivization in Ukraine and the rest of agriculturally focused Western Russia in the early 1930s. So they're like, okay, we'll sign these agreements with Poland, we'll calm that down while we do this other stuff. But fundamentally, ideologically, they don't really accept the existence of Poland. So these diplomatic initiatives, there's not that much there. They're not really going to long term resolve Poland's external problems. Poland, by the way, very short tangent here, has internal problems too. You referred to them when you sort of said, well, now they got to create an army out of people who are fighting in 3 different armies and people who are used to 3 different traditions and people who are used to their hierarchy in life goes towards the Kaiser in Vienna or goes towards the Kaiser in Berlin or goes towards the Tsar, right? And that mental world is different. And it takes time to build that up. 10% of Second Republic Poland's population is also Jewish. And relationships between the Jewish minority and the Catholic majority can be strained. There is a brand of Polish anti Semitism in politics, for example, that occurs. There's also a really big divide on what Poland should be. And the Second Republic Poland that comes out of World War I and the struggle with Germany and the struggle with the Soviet Union in the late teens, early 20s, doesn't fit either of the 2 big visions of what is the kind of preferred Poland. So you have these 2 competing visions. One is we should be a compact nation state. So if there are these regions which are mostly Ukrainian, regions that are mostly Belarusian, we don't want them. Just let the Russians have them or whatever, mostly. We want to make sure that we are a Polish nation state. Dmowski was the politician who was kind of the main voice for this idea. Then you have the other famous politician, or the most famous Polish politician of the interwar period, Pilsudski. Josef fought, of course, as a general in the Austro-Hungarian forces in the First World War, becomes president afterwards. His vision's different. He looks back to the old Polish Commonwealth and says what Poland should be is a kind of confederation with Lithuania, with Belarus, with Ukraine. That's the only way it's going to survive against these 2 big, powerful neighbors who are going to be upset that it exists. So he was pushing for that at the end of the First World War. He's like, we need a massive confederation here. Of course, Poland would be the dominant part. That's not really up for questioning, but a confederation. That doesn't work. They end up with an in-between state where they have parts that are populated by other ethnic groups, and they don't have a compact nation state. It's something in between. So that, I think, is also a fundamental challenge and perhaps in some ways a fundamental weakness of Second Republic Poland that's going to be exploited in particular by the Soviets, because the Polish authorities don't really treat the Ukrainians equally. There's a lot of restrictions on language rights and this kind of thing, which, then there are a few, I don't know, some would call them terrorists, some would call them freedom fighters on the Ukrainian side trying to resist Polish rule. So Poland, the problems are not only external, they also have internal difficulties.
Absolutely. Maybe we can bring it back for one moment to the Franco-Polish alliance and the 2 nations working together. And looking at it from a German perspective is also quite interesting when you look at what the Germans thought of all this. Because in the 1920s and early 30s, when you look at the military planning that you find in the German system, they're very, very clear. And they say in the early 1920s, they say, well, you know what, we can win a war against Poland. That is still possible because you still have got enough people who've served in the First World War. You still got some material. That is possible. That goes away by the late 1920s, early 1930s. And the Germans say, we're probably not even going to win a war against Poland. However, they're also very, very clear that whatever happens in the East doesn't really matter, because the moment there's a war breaking out between Poland and Germany, France will attack. And it's really interesting when you look at the war games that the Germans run in that particular period, all the way to, might say, the early to mid 1930s. they all end up with the same scenario. Whatever happens, it's always the French invading Germany. And then the question really only is, where does the German army stand, fight, and really die? It's quite interesting. So they were quite realistic about this. So there's nothing of this great, well, let's have a blitzkrieg and crush Poland and then France. A very, very different approach. And that, of course, is exactly what the French also wanted to achieve. So their cordon sanitaire, so Poland, particularly Czechoslovakia, bit of a buffer zone, trying to squeeze in Germany between France and particularly these two states. So you can see it all kind of makes sense. But that also means that you get an over-reliance, perhaps you might say, on the Polish side when it comes to France and French support. And I think we'll get to that later when we look at the actual outbreak of the war. But that's very, very important, because that featured very highly also in political and also military and strategic thinking on the Polish side. And you also talked about some of these treaties. That's also really interesting. So you have all this going on. You've got these tensions, you've got nationalism. Perhaps you might even say slightly different types of nationalism, as you explained in Poland. You've got that going on, not nationalism, but something else in the Soviet Union. And of course, you've got it in Germany as well. And then suddenly, after all this talk about Poland must disappear and Poland is not a proper state, as you said, in 1934, Germany signs a non-aggression treaty with Poland. And why does Poland sign it then? And also then, of course, as you said, with the Soviet Union. That's really confusing. And people at the time were confused. They say, hang on, so you've got someone in charge here, Hitler, so you've been talking about Jews and Poles and all this and getting the territories big, and suddenly signs this treaty. Where does that come from? Again, you need to look at the bigger geostrategic picture here, because it was mainly, you might argue, was the Poles pushing for this, because they were getting cold feet, because they knew that there had been an initiative, the Four Nations Initiative had been called, so it was Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, that signed a treaty, wasn't ratified, to basically sort out all problems in Europe. Cut a very long story quite short. And of course, the Poles thought, well, if these four nations get into bed, we are going to have a problem, because, well, we'll be at the receiving end. Well, think to Czechoslovakia 1938, 1939. So you're basically, that's the horror scenario. So they basically go onto the offensive, they get the initiative, grasp the initiative, and really, I wouldn't say force, but make very, very clear to Germany and also the Soviet Union that they want to sign these non-aggression treaties. On the German side, even internal in Germany, people are very confused why Hitler signed that. But you explained why, because it was convenient at that particular time. And as we know, Hitler and probably lots of other politicians don't really regard treaties as very, very binding. Pacta sunt servanda and all that. But there we are, different story. But it gave him the free hand to do other things before, of course, he then returned to Poland later on. And of course, when you look at, if you fast forward a little bit, again, a bit more Hitler stuff, you might say, when you look at what Hitler says about Poland, yes, Poland has to disappear, but it's mainly about getting the former German territories back. To begin with, Hitler is not really too concerned. His early writings and in the speech, what happens, for example, to Warsaw? No, that's not German territory. Well, the Russians can have it, or wherever. When Poland disappears, go back to the divisions of the 18th century. In some ways, to put it quite flippantly, you might say Poland is unlucky because Poland is also just in the way. Because Hitler, of course, has got these ideas about expansion of the East, the Lebensraum, the living space, and that, of course, is the Soviet Union. In order to get there, of course, you need to go through Poland. There are some stories and accounts that he actually proposed some sort of coalition with Poland to go against the Soviet Union. How true that is, whether they really meant it or not, that can probably be debated. It has been debated. But again, it's interesting when you put Poland in the center of all this, the geostrategic issues that you find at that time, and they're only worsening for Poland. So the closer you get to World War II, the worse it gets for Poland, and it's really not a good situation to be in.
Absolutely not. I also think, if memory serves, this, I didn't read this in the lead up to this podcast, but I feel like I've seen it somewhere else. The Germans at some point floated the idea to the Polish government of, hey, we don't want the German Jews. Would you take them? Can we deport them to you in Poland? And of course, that didn't happen, but this was a very strange diplomatic initiative in a way. But
it does not happen for a very specific reason. And the reason is that the Germans say, okay, we're going to get the Jews out, in particular those who say we have some sort of Polish connection, whatever shape or form. And they announced this, and the Poles say, no, we're not taking them. They don't want them. So the Germans then say, okay, in a month or 2 months' time, we're going to send all these Poles across and the Jews across. And the Poles say, no, you're not doing this. So there's a rush on the German side to get these guys across before that deadline is set themselves, because they think the Poles are not ready and will let them in. But then the Poles say, no, we're closing the border. So that comes back to your point about general anti-Semitism that you find in that part of the world. I mean, we have to be honest about this. Anti-Semitism is widespread in that part of the world at that particular time. When you look at some of the pogroms in the interwar period, also at the beginning of the Second World War, maybe we get to all of this later, but it is there. We don't want to go into Holocaust right now, but probably suffices to say that without at least some support from some part of the population, the Holocaust in its form as it happened would probably not have been possible. Because when you look at the people who supported the Holocaust, supervised, planned, executed at the highest level, of course, by the German authorities, but with a lot of support from the local population, wouldn't have happened. So that's another aspect, another
yes,
facet.
and for different reasons too, not just ideological anti-Semitism. There are all sorts of other practical, ingratiating yourself, and so on and so forth. Which is apparently my catchphrase, I've been told, and so on and so forth. I can tell you that is the first time I've said it in this episode. I'm 99% sure. So,
I do know what they also have in Poland. Lots of deep, dark woods. There we go.
Absolutely. They have, I think they have the only herd of like European wild bison that runs free in northeastern Poland. They have a big national park there, which I would love to visit one day.
Which is also the area which Goering, because he was also the head of all huntsmen in Germany, designated that his own personal hunting ground.
Okay.
Because he wanted to have that, so he wanted to shoot some whatever bisons or whatever they are. So
I mean,
that's another.
He was half the size of a bison himself. I don't know how he was going to make it into the deep dark woods to actually take a shot at one. But let's get back on track here in order to sort of maybe wrap up this first context introduction episode to the Polish War, to the Polish campaign in 1939. So you have this situation around Poland, inside Poland that we talked about, that is very, very difficult for the survival of the Polish Second Republic. They rely on this alliance with France, which dates back to the early 1920s. Britain then decides to, no, Munich. Can't skip over Munich because, I have to say, Poland's in a difficult situation, but there's still some nationalists in Poland who think, well, we deserve more territory. And not in the confederation sense necessarily that Pilsudski had thought about in the teens and 20s, but just, well, historically, other Polish states had more territory than we do now in the 1930s, so we should take opportunities as they come. Now, in hindsight, that looks pretty foolish, but at the time, it seemed logical from their point of view. And when the Munich Agreement is made, and Germany annexes first the so-called Sudetenland, then also Bohemia, and creates a puppet fascist Slovak state, Poland takes kind of unilateral action and grabs a small piece of Czechoslovakia for itself, a very small piece. I'm pretty sure it's around the town of Teschen in German. I don't know what it is in Polish. So this is kind of, in hindsight, Poland has taken a lot of criticism from outside, especially from the Soviet and Russian side for this, accusing them of whatever cooperating and planning stuff with the Nazis. It was more opportunistic, and the Germans were surprised, but they didn't immediately attack and throw the Poles out. So this is another little wrinkle in the situation. And of course, then after, in March 1939, when the Germans break the Munich Agreement, annex Bohemia, which they'd said they would not do, Britain also gives guarantees to Poland. So now you don't only have an alliance with France, you have an agreement with Britain from spring 1939 that if Germany attacks, these two great powers will come to Poland's aid in some way, shape, or form. It's a bit more specific for the French. That is the situation going into summer 1939. Maybe you could say, all right, well, with the British and the French, maybe the Poles are not that badly off. But of course, the Soviet Union is the wild card, and that all changes in August 1939, which we will have to explore in our next episode. Matthias, why don't you fill in the last couple gaps, and then we'll leave people on a cliffhanger?
Maybe just a very, very short point. It's very good that you talked about Munich and all the, let's call it the Polish land grab, which I think probably today most people don't really know about. I mean, particularly when we talk about Munich, it's all about Germany and all these things that you explained. It is really interesting. So the territory that they occupy is actually quite small by comparison. So it's called the Hulciner Ländchen. That's what it's called in German. I've got no idea what it's called in other languages. So it is quite small, but it is a sign, it's a symbol. And isn't it interesting that Putin, in some of his speeches, in his recent speeches, has actually mentioned that and had said, well, who are you in the West, including Poland, to tell us, for example, not to invade Ukraine and get our territories back and minorities and all this, when you are actually working together, and that comes back to the point you made, working together with the Nazis in a land grab, which definitely wasn't yours. It's interesting. So here you've got a very, very clear example of where historical action is still very much with us today. Probably not so much in the West, but in other parts of the world, Central and Eastern Europe, this is something that if you want to remember it, and if you want to put some sort of political spin on it, you can still do, and people would still know what you're talking about. So that, of course, put, as you explained, Poland politically, you might say, in a bit of a difficult position. It didn't take away the guarantees that you already mentioned, and that we're going to go into in a bit more detail probably in the next episode. But I just want to throw this in. So a very, very clear link from 1939 to all the way to what have we got now, 2025, linking to events that are happening in the Ukraine, in Russia. So really, really interesting.
Yeah, there are a couple of other links we can throw in the pot here before we leave off for this episode. And that is these tensions between the Ukrainian minority in Second Republic Poland in the 20s and 30s and the Polish majority. And relations between Poland and Ukraine today, yes, Poland is supporting Ukraine with weapons and all sorts of other material to help them defend themselves against Russia. But there's a lot of tension. And one of the focuses of this political tension goes back to this time period, the 30s and 40s, because, of course, there's then ethnic cleansing that the Ukrainians carry out in some regions against Poles in 1943. The Ukrainians at the time, the nationalists would say, yeah, but that's because there was repression by the Poles when it was part of Poland. So there are other echoes as well that are still visible today if you're paying close attention to the headlines from Eastern Europe. So we've brought the story now more or less from early modern times and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, disappearance of an independent Poland, to the very fraught and difficult 1920s and 1930s and the relationships there, which I think sets the stage for where we'll go in our next episode, which is the game changer, really, that sets things off, which is the Nazi-Soviet pact. Before we leave you for today, I want to give a shout out. I want to say thank you to someone out there. And that is, let me make sure I get the name right here. And that is Vince Di Fiore from the United States. Why am I thanking Vince? Because Vince has become a kernel level supporter of our podcast. And folks, that is how we can do this. That's what allows us to do our work here, to create these tangents and endless episodes of us rambling about things that we think are cool and hopefully some of you think are cool. It's supporters of the podcast like Vince who make that possible. If you would like to support us out there, you can do so by going to our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can ask us questions. We'll prioritize your questions if you're a supporter. You can also get access to exclusive content that is not on Spotify or YouTube or anywhere else in our war room. If you want to try the whole thing out for a month for free, you can use the code Deep Dark Woods, which is, of course, Matthias's favorite expression, and see what it's like and see what we've got there, and then decide if you want to become an awesome supporter like Vince. So that was it for today. We'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Should have called it the Führer bunker around the war room, but there we are. We had this discussion.
No, dude, no. No, I will quit. I will quit. My grandfather would roll in his grave.
Oh, funny.